Good morning. Thank you for coming. I'm just thrilled to be here. I'll be talking to you today about the Rhode Island economy and its experience in the Great Recession and where the state's economy stands today and looking forward. My goal here is to inform current policy debates rather than to prescribe any specific policies. I also should tell you that the views I express here are my own, and they do not represent the official views of the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston or of the Federal Reserve System. So just to give you some background about how I got interested in studying Rhode Island's economy, part of my job as an economist at the Boston Fed is to follow the New England economy. And I give periodic briefings on the economy to local business leaders and public policy makers. And these briefings usually consist of a set of stock charts and some discussion on noteworthy economic developments, but typically not much deep analysis. During the Great Recession and the financial crisis, we had a lot of noteworthy economic developments to report on, unfortunately, all of them negative. The good thing, though, was the briefings no longer seemed perfunctory. People paid closer attention because there was something real at stake. And so a question that started to come up in these briefings was why Rhode Island had fared so much worse than the other states in the Great Recession. So just one example of Rhode Island's worst performance is the jobs it lost between the peak of employment just before the recession and what we call the trough or low point of employment at the end of the recession or even after the recession, but before the jobs started to come back. Well, Rhode Island lost 8% of its payroll jobs during that time period. Connecticut was a close second at just under 7%, but all of the other New England states lost way fewer jobs than Rhode Island, and nationwide, the peak-to-trough job decline was just over 6%. So Rhode Island clearly was somewhat of an outlier, the weakest link in the region, so people wanted to know why. And by the way, that 8% represents about 40,000 jobs. So that's a pretty significant chunk of jobs. So the same question started coming up in our internal brainstorming meetings about topics worthy of deeper analysis. But for a long time, nobody took up the topic in earnest. There were some sort of casual explanations thrown out. One of my colleagues noted that the manufacturing sector in Rhode Island had really tanked in the recession, and that probably was a big chunk of it. My own pet theory, just based on looking at the graphs, was that the construction industry was to blame. I knew that the construction sector had grown massively during the housing boom in Rhode Island, and I figured that it also tanked farther in the recession as well. So that was my own sort of preliminary theory. But as I said, nobody really decided to look into and validate any of these theories. But when the question refused to go away, now we're talking about around 2013, just like Rhode Island's high unemployment rate refused to go away. So let's just look at this graph for a minute. The orange line shows Rhode Island's unemployment rate beginning in 2000. And the blue area is the minimum. It's a range from the minimum unemployment rate across U.S. states to the maximum across U.S. states at any given time. So as you can see, during the early and mid-2000s, Rhode Island was right in the middle of the pack. And it reached an unemployment rate of 4.7% before the recession. It was, just cruising around right about equal with Massachusetts. It was just doing fine. And then in the span of 2 years, unemployment in Rhode Island surges to over 11%. And then for a couple years, Rhode Island is among the top 6 states in the nation in terms of unemployment rate. And even times you can see Rhode Island was had the highest unemployment rate in the nation for periods of time in the recovery period, okay? And recently unemployment has come down in Rhode Island, but it's still higher than the US unemployment rate. Another thing to notice here is that in the 2001 recession, those gray areas, shaded areas are recession periods. In the earlier recession, Rhode Island didn't really have high unemployment. So it really was a puzzle as to why Rhode Island was seeing such high unemployment, not just relative to the region, but relative to the US as a whole. So as I said, this question just refused to go away. And so I finally decided that I was going to take on this topic and I was going to apply some rigorous economic analysis. As a graduate of Brown University with an abiding affection for Providence, I even felt a personal stake in this issue. To cut to the punchline, the culprit wasn't manufacturing or construction. It was manufacturing and construction and a whole lot of other things. So it's complicated, but not intractable. And my goal here is to unpack some of that complexity to help inform economic policy for Rhode Island's future. So first, let me establish some terms. Economists define a recession as a period of falling economic activity spread across the economy, lasting more than a few months. This definition, by the way, owes to the arbiters of recession at the National Bureau of Economic Research, housed in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Oh, wait a minute, that's not the definition of a recession. That's the definition of understatement. To put it in human terms, and probably some of you know this all too well, during a recession, people lose jobs, people lose their houses, and people lose faith. And those losses reinforce the vicious circle of economic decline. So how recessions actually get started in the first place is a subject of some debate among economists. You think we would have figured this out by now. There's a lot of reasons why recessions can occur, although none of the explanations are really very satisfying. Business confidence falls, or there's adverse technology shocks, productivity shocks. Now, in the case of the Great Recession, there's actually widespread agreement that the housing bubble and the accompanying financial crisis led us into the Great Recession. We still might disagree as to how that actually caused a recession. For example, we're not sure if foreclosures caused unemployment or vice versa. It's probably some of each. But we do all agree that this was a really bad recession, and it really caught us rather off guard. So since the housing bubble was seen as the explanation for the national recession, some economists asked whether having a more severe housing boom and bust might explain why some parts of the country had more severe recessions than others. The answer seems to be yes. So let's look at what happened to house prices in Rhode Island. Does this theory work for Rhode Island? Well, Rhode Island did actually have quite a pronounced housing boom and bust cycle. This house price index here is indexed to 2000. So as you can see, between 2000 and the peak of house prices in Rhode Island, house prices more than doubled in Rhode Island. That was a sharper increase than in any other state in the region. And this obviously led to a construction boom, because when house prices go up, it's more profitable to build and sell houses. So this was the picture behind my initial theory. I knew that construction employment had surged in Rhode Island more than in any other state in the region. And as I said before, I figured construction employment had probably fallen more steeply too. And while that turns out to be true, the decline, as you can see, the construction employment declined sharply here, and more sharply than in any other state. But it turns out that construction jobs alone can explain only 16% of the recession job losses in Rhode Island. It just wasn't a huge chunk of the state's economy. Even though it had grown, it just doesn't account for a large share of jobs. However, house prices don't just affect construction employment. When people's house prices go up, they feel wealthier, their net worth goes up. They actually are wealthier on paper. They can borrow more money, so they spend more money. So this creates jobs in retail, real estate services, finance, and many other sectors of the economy. So it turns out that if you link house price growth and decline to employment growth and decline in the aggregate, Rhode Island's rank in the region in terms of its house price declines in the recession can explain its rank in terms of the job losses. So this shows you all the states in the region, what was the peak to trough change in their house prices. And again, Rhode Island is on the far left of this picture. And the ordering of these states in this picture is exactly the same as it was in the earlier picture when I showed you each of the New England states' job losses during the recession. So you can perfectly order the states' job losses and predict that order based on the order of their house price declines in the recession. And as I said, it wasn't just construction jobs, but it was jobs across the economy. So, end of story, right? Well, it's not that simple. You know I've got 10 minutes left or so. And I haven't said anything about manufacturing yet. Oops. So let's look at what was going on in the manufacturing sector, and let's start before the recession. So again, I'm indexing manufacturing employment in Rhode Island to its 2000 level. Gray areas show the recessions. Between 2000 and the end of 2007, the state lost nearly 22,000 jobs from its manufacturing sector. That was a decline of 30%. Then during the recession, these job losses accelerated. Manufacturing employment fell even more steeply. The state lost another 8,400 jobs. Since then, in the recovery, manufacturing employment basically flat. At least it's not still falling. So the sector that had accounted for up to 15% or 15% of the state's jobs currently accounts for only 9% of the state's jobs. So what was going on here? Why was manufacturing losing so many jobs, and why was it losing them even before the recession started? The economist David Autor and some co-authors, he's at MIT, his co-authors are at some other places, wrote a paper that showed that rising import competition from China in particular helped to explain why some places experienced severe declines in their manufacturing employment between 1990 and 2007. So it turns out that Rhode Island, and Providence in particular, they studied metro areas, had the bad luck of producing a lot of the kinds of things that could be produced more cheaply in China. We're talking about labor-intensive production, things like jewelry and toys, historically strong in the state. So it was just historical accident of the kinds of manufacturing that was specialized, that Rhode Island specialized in. And these goods tended to be produced by people without a college education, in some cases even people without a high school education. So how big was the impact? So does anyone remember how many manufacturing jobs Rhode Island lost between 2000 and 2007? 22,000. Okay, good guess. So how much of those can be explained by this trade import effect, this rising import competition from China? A lowball estimate is that 40%, or about 8,700 of those jobs, can be explained by the fact that cheaper imports of the same goods that were being produced in Rhode Island, cheaper imports were coming in from China and undercutting those goods produced in Rhode Island. That's a lowball estimate. The highball estimate, over 18,000 of those jobs can be explained by rising import competition between 2000 and 2007. And this is a much larger chunk than can be explained nationwide. As I said, Rhode Island was particularly vulnerable, particularly exposed to this import competition effect. Providence ranks second among the largest metro areas in terms of this import exposure during the period. And by the way, this was in place before 2000. This had to do with technological changes in China, forces outside of our control. And in 2001, this effect accelerated as China entered the World Trade Organization. But the sneaky thing, as I showed you before, unemployment was doing just fine in Rhode Island in the mid-2000s when all these manufacturing jobs were being lost. So the job losses were hidden by the housing boom. People found jobs in other sectors. Construction among them, but other parts of the economy were doing pretty well at the same time. So just to get a better sense of how much of an impact these job losses in manufacturing had on the economy, because it's hard to see, as I said, they were kind of hidden during that pre-recession period. What you can do is look at all jobs and look at their time series since 2000 to 2015. Again, these are all indexed, okay, to where they were in 2000. Look at all jobs in Rhode Island. Sure, they were rising overall, but if you look at where the state is now, they're basically the same level of jobs as the state had in 2000. If you take manufacturing out of that picture, it looks a lot better. If you take manufacturing out of that picture, current employment level is almost as high as it was just before the recession, which, by the way, was the state's all-time high employment level, and up 8% since 2000, as opposed to just flat since 2000. So manufacturing clearly has been holding back overall job growth in the state. And as I said, this is due to longer-term global, or what we call structural factors, meaning these jobs are potentially permanent job losses. Another way to look at this impact and compare this impact between Rhode Island and the other New England states and the US, again, now we're just looking at the net change in manufacturing employment over that time. Rhode Island fell 43%. Other New England states, 36% on average. The rest of the country, only 29%. That's still pretty bad. This is showing you that this is a global phenomenon affecting the country at large, but affecting Rhode Island more severely. But non-manufacturing jobs grew more in Rhode Island than in the rest of the region. It's almost a tie, okay? Not as much as non-manufacturing jobs grew in the US overall and the other states, but pretty close. The relative performance is much better. So clearly there's a disparity between the manufacturing employment growth and the non-manufacturing employment growth. And that disparity was enough to effectively cancel out the job growth in the rest of the economy. So this blue columns are just all jobs again. Net change between 2000 and 2014. There's your basically no job growth in Rhode Island over that time period. If you take manufacturing out, you got an almost 8% increase. US, up 5.5% overall, looking much better. So manufacturing was a drag everywhere, but it was a much bigger drag in New England, and even a bigger drag in Rhode Island in particular, within New England. So, manufacturing's in a coma. Do we resuscitate? Suppose there were a treatment available, and suppose that that treatment were available retroactively, so that we could go back to the trough of a recession, and let's assume that manufacturing in Rhode Island had grown at the same pace that it grew nationally. So since the recession trough, manufacturing employment has actually increased in the US 7.5%. So let's apply that growth rate to the manufacturing sector. And now I'm just going to look at Providence, and you'll see why in a minute. It's almost the same economic entity as Rhode Island, but not quite. At the trough of the recession, Providence as a metro area had about 40,000 jobs, okay? Currently, it has about 560,000, okay? So it's recovered some of its jobs, but if you applied the growth rate of the US manufacturing sector to Providence manufacturing sector, we'd have about 1,400 more jobs than we currently have. So that's something, but it's not a really big boost. It's probably not as big as you might have expected. Now there's another treatment, New Bedford. I bet you didn't know that New Bedford, which also has seen terrible job losses from its manufacturing sector, has had a better overall employment recovery than Providence, and a lot of that is due to very rapid growth in the health and education services sector, which encompasses a lot of things, but that sector has been particularly strong nationally and particularly strong in New Bedford. And so if we apply the growth rate of that sector to the same sector in Providence since the trough of the recession, now Providence would have 10,000 more jobs than it currently has. So that's a much bigger boost. But why aren't those jobs here? Why aren't they coming here? Well, anecdotally, if you talk to employers, they say they just can't find the workers with the right skills. Well, why aren't the workers with the right skills here? They say there are no jobs. Classic catch-22, chicken and egg problem. By the way, Rhode Island has more high school dropouts in its workforce than any other state in the region. And it's second only to Maine in terms of the share, having a low share of college-educated workers. So the education level of the workforce, these employers are commenting on that as a factor that's restraining their willingness to locate here. So one example, CVS opened its Tech Development Center in Boston, not Woonsocket. They wanted to be close to the other high-tech jobs. We all know Rhode Island has top-notch universities, my alma mater among them. It would be great if it could get more of its high school graduates to, first of all, to graduate and to go to universities, and if it could retain more of those graduates. Again, they need to know the jobs are waiting for them. So summing up, the housing boom and bust do explain a large share of job losses during the recession and Rhode Island's rank, But manufacturing has really been the biggest obstacle to the state's job growth since 2000. Some places are growing despite weak manufacturing because they're creating more jobs in other parts of the economy. Thank you very much for coming. If you want to read more, those are the references. Thank you.